You live by the sword, you die by the sword. I don't know if you've ever heard that expression before. It's one that's used of very trivial, very little things in life, but it's one that's used on very significant sort of nation-changing sorts of decisions as well. The idea is if you treat people in a certain way on your rise to power, when it comes time for your rise to power to stop and your fall from power to come, chances are a lot of those things are going to come full circle. If you're very respectful of people, if you're very cordial, if you go about things in the proper way, often, not always, but often you'll receive a very similar response to people on your way down. But if you're very cutthroat and very underhanded and used people and manipulated people on your rise to the top, you can bet that there's not going to be near as much, if any, grace extended to you on the way back down, right? You live by the sword, you die by the sword. As we look at the second group, I guess, of four woes that we find in Habakkuk chapter 2 this week. We're going to look at the final two, woes in verses 12 to 17. And both of these sort of reflect this sort of attitude towards Babylon. The Lord wants Habakkuk to understand that yes, Babylon is very strong, and yes, them coming and disciplining the people of Israel will not be enjoyable. But he also wants them to understand that Babylon's time is also short. And the Lord has a plan for them in that. And it's going to very much reflect that same sort of live by the sword, die by the sword mentality. The two woes that are talked about here focus on how Babylon treated the nations that they conquered on their rise to power. We see in these two woes that the Babylonians were very violent and very brutal. They oppressed people. Right? It wasn't enough just to conquer a nation. They had to wipe them out. And it was very brutal, and there was lots of death and destruction. And this was one of the ways that they sort of cemented their power, right? If they just wiped out every nation that they conquered, then what would be left to oppose them? But the Lord wanted them to understand here through Habakkuk. He wanted Habakkuk to understand that all of their accomplishments and all their success was only fuel for the fire. It was not going to last. And we know that because the nation of Babylon and all their accomplishments, if you want to visit them today, if you want to know about them, you got to go to a museum, right? It's not there anymore. Yes, they seemed impregnable in this period of time when Habakkuk was being written, but in the grand scheme of world history, they were just a dot on the map. So their brutalness would not justify or would not result, rather, in an everlasting empire like they thought that it would, right? They were very brutal, very violent, and their end was as well very brutal and very violent. The fourth woe, the final woe in this little section of Habakkuk, had to do with the fact that the Babylonians didn't just brutally destroy their enemies, they also deceived them, they also shamed them. And the picture given here is of someone giving somebody else a bunch of alcohol to drink until they basically exposed themselves and made a fool out of themselves and brought shame on themselves. And this was part of how Babylon conquered the nations around them as well. It wasn't just enough to destroy them. They also wanted to shame them and embarrass them and humiliate them. And again, God promises to Babylon that in the same way that they've done this to others, this will happen to them as well. As we look at these final two woes, there's a couple different sort of application points I want to draw out of them. There's a lot that we could talk about in these, and we could take these in a whole bunch of different directions, but I hope you'll bear with me in the ones that I chose to take it. And if you've got other questions or thoughts, feel free to comment below or send me a message, give me a call, something like that. First of all, one of the things that we can see out of all of these woes, but out of these last two especially, is comparing and contrasting God's discipline of his people, which we've already talked about is coming, right? That was where the book of Habakkuk started, with Habakkuk calling out to God and asking why, his own people weren't being disciplined when they weren't living like they were supposed to. And so God says, I'm going to discipline them. Babylon's going to come, and that just throws all sorts of flags in Habakkuk's mind. But what we need to understand out of this, and something that Habakkuk hopefully saw through this, was the fact that God's own people would be disciplined, but they wouldn't be destroyed. Whereas God's enemies, the Babylonians here as a picture of that, wouldn't just be disciplined. This was going to be destruction. When God was through with them, when he had, done what he wanted to do with them and used them in that sense, then they would be ultimately destroyed. There wouldn't be a remnant left. It wouldn't be the same sort of discipline meant to bring growth. No, this would be destruction. Now, for Habakkuk and for the people of Israel, that was probably would have brought an element of relief. Yes, this is going to be brutal, but these people, they won't survive long term. God has a plan, and he's going to look after us. And so there's a difference between God's discipline of his own people and the punishment against those who don't know him at all. And so this is encouraging probably for the Jewish people, but it's also a good reminder for you and for I today on why it's important for us to be sharing the news of the gospel with other people, as well as that there is punishment awaiting those who don't know Christ as their Savior. Those of us who do, there sometimes is discipline along the way, and it's not always enjoyable, but it's done for our growth, done for our good. And that's very different than that punishment that's awaiting at the end of time for those who don't know Christ. And we get a snapshot of that here with Babylon in the book of Habakkuk. But another point, and this is my final thing here before we wrap up today, another sort of point of application that we will need to see through this is that as the Lord plans to deal with Babylon, he's not just thinking about how he's going to deal with those who have sinned against him. He also is working out a plan that is going to bring a knowledge of himself to as many different people as possible, with the plan to draw people in. Now, ultimately, we see this done through Christ, but it maybe helps to understand and explain a little bit why God's timing works the way it does in this particular point in history. God could have just wiped out Babylon there and then, but he had a different plan in place and was all working towards letting as many people know about him as possible, and hopefully bringing some of them to salvation as well. And as I said, there is a lot of different ways that we could have taken this passage, but those are the things I wanted to draw out of it for you this afternoon. And we got a few weeks left here in the study on Habakkuk. I hope you're finding it helpful. It's been good for me to dive into this and kind of wrestle with how we apply some of these sorts of things to us today. But I do hope that this was helpful for you this afternoon, and I hope you have a good rest of your Tuesday. Thanks for joining us.